All right, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brianna Widener and I'm an education specialist with the Washington Invasive Species Council. The Invasive Species Council, we were established by the legislature in 2006 and we're tasked with providing policy level direction, planning, and coordination for combating harmful invasive species throughout the state and preventing the introduction of others that might potentially be harmful to Washington. One of our major roles we play is education and outreach, and this week Governor Jay Inslee proclaimed February 24th to March 2nd, 2019 as Washington Invasive Species Awareness Week, and that's obviously to raise awareness but also to find preventative solutions for invasive species. So this webinar today is one of the Washington Invasive Species Awareness Week activities we have scheduled, so you could visit invasivespecies.wa.gov to see some other activities we have coming up. And we're excited today because this webinar is being co-hosted by the Oregon Invasive Species Council, and we have Rick Boatner with the Oregon Invasive Species Council here with us, and we're going to have him just tell us a little about his council.
Hi everyone, this is Rick Boatner. I'm the Invasive Species Wildlife Integrity Supervisor for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and also a member of the Oregon Invasive Species Council and a past chair. And Oregon Invasive Species Council consists of 18 members. 7 are from various state agencies and 2 universities. And then we have 10 members that are from the all around the state, from associated with various industry or NGOs. The Oregon Invasive Species Council was set up by the legislators in the early 2000s. And our main goals are to develop a reporting system for invasive species. We produce education material. We develop statewide invasive species plan, operate a website, and then we also conduct educational meetings and conferences with the council.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rick. I'm pleased to now introduce our speaker, Dr. Julian Olden, who is going to tell us a little bit more about invasive crayfish. Julian is a professor and a researcher at the University of Washington in Seattle in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. Today, Julian's going to be focusing on the current state of non-native crayfish and their impacts in our region. And he's also going to tell us what's being done to monitor, predict their movements, and manage this invasion. And with that, I'm going to pass this on to Julian.
Howdy, folks. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Thanks, Brianna. I really appreciate it. Thanks to you and Justin Bush for this opportunity to chat with you all in a one-way through this webinar about kind of some of the challenges around invasive crayfish in the Pacific Northwest, some of the ways in which they're kind of coming in, and some of the ways in which we can try to manage them in the future. This black and white photo is not to try to make any ominous kind of future for the Columbia River, but I think some of the messages I'm going to have today are going to be really talking about how the Northwest is a really emerging beachhead, if you will, of crayfish invasions, and that the time is to really act now before we repeat many of the lessons of invasive crayfish impacts that are seen more in the northeast and eastern part of North America. Just a quick kind of primer, if you will. There's anywhere between 650 to 700 freshwater crayfish globally. About half of that diversity, a bit more than half that diversity, actually occurs in the southeastern part of the United States, which is a really endemic hotspot. Here in the Pacific Northwest, many of you are probably aware of our native signal crayfish, given by its big white spot on the chela there, kind of signaling from below the water to above. There's a huge amount of cryptic diversity within this group, likely multiple species, or we're currently recognizing multiple subspecies across the basin. So many of you have seen kind of a signal crayfish that might look like this. This is also called the American crayfish. There's some kind of subspecies, Clamthensis, for example, which is quite red. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of, really quick, the history of crayfish invasions in the Western United States, and then focusing in on one case study. I think it's quite remarkable that within the region, we have very low amount of native diversity of crayfish, and that's really been dwarfed now by the number of non-native species that have been introduced over the last 40 or 50 years. This is a rough chronology of kind of the types of species that we've seen come through time. It's a kind of really conservative estimate because often reporting occurs after, obviously, crayfish first come in. But you can see that across different states of the western U.S., a whole variety of species have come in, mainly within Orconectes, the genus Orconectes, which I'll talk about in a second. But Procambarus, the red swamp crayfish, is another big invader. So let's really focus in on the kind of top 4 invaders, if you will, here in the Pacific Northwest. So the map to the right shows their kind of some of the distributions. This was data which is kind of correlated by myself and Eric Larson, who was a student, PhD student in my lab at the time, as well as folks from USGS. What we see is there's kind of 4 main players, if you will. There's a red swamp crawfish, shown in the red stars. We've revealed a number of populations in the greater Seattle area, but a real hot spot for that is in the Willamette River, as well as places in Umpqua and the Rogue River. There's northern crayfish, which is very high densities in the Columbia River Basin in eastern Washington. There's kind of what was originally localized populations of ringed crayfish, again in kind of southern Oregon. And then there's this emerging invasion of rusty crayfish. All of these were formerly Orconectes. The genus has changed now, but the challenges have not with respect to moving forward. In many ways, this is really a turf war. These are relatively new emerging invasions, so I'm actually, and others are very optimistic in terms of the way in which we might be able to manage these invaders moving forward. So that is, they're not very, very widespread. So there's really opportunities still to try to prevent secondary spread and try to minimize their impacts. Really quickly, there's a number of pathways, if you will, some traditional and some not, in terms of crayfish introductions in the Pacific Northwest. Traditional pathways, particularly in other parts of their range, include using crayfish as live bait, and then mainly around fishing for black basses, and then releasing that live bait into water bodies. That's a smaller vector, I would argue, here in the western parts of the United States. What has really emerged is the use of live crayfish in the classroom for educational purposes, and then the unfortunate situation of releasing those crayfish, either school teachers or classroom release parties, into different water bodies. And then there's a number of crayfish that are in the pet aquarium trade, and often when people tire of them, they're released. But there's a longer history of introducing crayfish, particularly in Montana and other states, to actually provide forage for sport fish. So introducing them before centrarchids or black bass were initially introduced. That obviously is not occurring anymore. They are also introduced into golf course ponds to control aquatic weeds, and then during flooding they can secondarily spread from those water bodies. And then there's the unfortunate situation, the culture of raising crayfish for eating, human consumption, and the release of crayfish intentionally into urban waterways to then support harvesting opportunities in the future. And then finally, there's kind of this secondary spread from those existing populations, and I'll provide an example of that a little later in this webinar. Well, crayfish make a living in a variety of ways, and they have a variety of impacts, if you will, across diverse impacts across food webs. Most crayfish are very poly-trophic, and what I mean by that is that they can influence multiple levels of the food web, all the way from affecting things like primary production or algal recruitment, all the way up to secondary production, whether in terms of aquatic macroinvertebrates, gastropods, and direct predation on them. They've shown to have effects on amphibians through eating eggs, as well as on tadpoles and adults. They often outcompete other crayfish. So pictured to the left is our signal crayfish. And then there's been examples of them affecting actually through those effects, as well as directly on fish eggs, affecting kind of fisheries production. There's some nice work from the northern part of Wisconsin that shows that rusty crayfish, for example, has an estimated $1.5 million impact on the fisheries, centrarchid fisheries and panfish fisheries in that region. So the effects, both ecological and economic, can be quite devastating. We recently kind of just tried to put all of that ecological knowledge together. We did kind of a big meta-analysis, if you will, of all published studies across the world with a whole variety of different non-native species, and just asked, what is the overall evidence for the effects of crayfish? And in fact, this shows that they are very strong interactors on the landscape. The figure on the bottom just basically shows the results of that meta-analysis, an overall negative effect size. So anything going to the left of that shows that they have a negative effect across all components of the food web. And you can see whether it's rusty crayfish on the top, or red swamp crayfish, Clarkii, the third one down, they all have negative kind of impacts, although variable, generally negative across the entire food web. So if we just circle back to this figure here, I want to kind of spend a little bit of time focusing in on one case study of some work around kind of an emergent invader, an invader of strong concern, and that's focusing in on the rusty crayfish. And so what I'm going to do for the beginning here is just going to bring you into the John Day River Basin of Oregon to kind of use this, I would argue, as an example of what can happen when a prolific crayfish invades an open river system, and then really use this to highlight the challenge that we have regarding the potential future invasion of the Columbia River of a variety of crayfish. And so these lessons extend to other crayfish species, but I kind of want to highlight the John Day River here. This is the distribution of rusty crayfish across the United States. Light brown in the middle of the country there shows the upper Ohio River drainage. This is where rusty crayfish are native to. The red dots show kind of confirmed occurrences across the landscape. So rusty crayfish is now invaded over 24 states and provinces of Canada and the United States. It's been predominantly been moved around through bait bucket releases throughout the upper Midwest and the Northeast. And what you'll see is a kind of a cluster of dots, and a concerning cluster of dots over there in the John Day River in Oregon. And this was the first occurrence of the rusty crayfish west of the Continental Divide. It was initially misidentified as ring crayfish, and then work that myself did and Eric Larson and Jeff Adams then kind of correctly identified that as the rusty crayfish, and this has been kind of a point of study of my group for some time now. Rusty crayfish comes through a diverse variety of pathways, if you will. The introduction of this crayfish was likely through a school release. And again, rusty crayfish has got a diversity of impacts, again, because of their poly-trophic diet. And they can, and I'll show you in a second how the extremely high densities that they can meet. So that's a glorious mugshot, if you will, of the rusty crayfish. In these parts, anytime you see kind of a rust patch, kind of at the interior side of the carapace there, right where you grab the crayfish without getting pinched, wherever you grab it, if there's a rust spot there, it's a good indication, and although not perfect, a very strong indication in this region that that's a rusty crayfish. So I'm going to bring you to the John Day River of Oregon, quite a beautiful area. One of the last large free-flowing rivers in the United States. Also, one of the remaining strongholds of wild spring Chinook salmon, and a whole variety of other native salmonids makes this a very kind of important and iconic system to look at. So as I mentioned, this was kind of the first occurrence of rusty crayfish in the western part of North America. And this is why it was kind of a big concern. It was a big leap. It was a big move. And again, it was going into a region in which the resistance to its invasion, i.e. potentially other native crayfish, was actually quite low, with only the signal crayfish historically occupying the John Day River. So, and I just want to kind of show kind of a little bit of the distribution of rusty crayfish in the John Day River to kind of give you an indication of kind of how it's potentially spread through time. It was likely introduced right in this crayfish symbol there, somewhere between the towns of Mount Vernon and John Day, likely in the kind of the end of the 90s through a school release. I don't kind of have the time to talk more about that, but since that time, it's been kind of slowly moving. So the red dots show kind of its distribution, kind of circa 2005. in which when we went out and my group did a study of a variety of systems, black shows absence and the red dots show presence, with the size of the dot broadly representing different densities. Then there is work by Sorensen and others, and some additional work that we did that shows their distribution in 2010. You can see that there's kind of a large increase in the distribution of crayfish down the main stem into the lower main stem, turning the corner and going up into the South Fork of the John Day. And then work that a master student in my lab and I did, Matisse Messenger and I, we did a kind of a month-and-a-half long study of over 60 sites across the John Day River to get a really good estimate of its current distribution. And its spread over this time period was quite large. So you can see that it's turned the corner on the North Fork of the John Day and now making its way upstream, and then continuing to make a very large downstream movement into the lower main stem. All the way down to Cottonwood Canyon, where we saw its absence, but basically upstream of that, you can see its patchy distribution because of gaining access to that part of the river, but highly abundant. So if we quickly look at rusty crayfish densities, this is just CPUE, or crayfish per meter squared. It should be there. And this just shows the distance from the initial point of introduction. My point here is that as you go downstream, and you just follow from left to right on this plot along the main stem, you can see that that's the invasion wave, if you will. Crayfish densities on average are around 20 or so. That's 20 crayfish per meter squared, upwards to up close to 40 crayfish per meter squared in the South and the North Fork, and that's shown up in the top left-hand corner, all the way kind of down to lower numbers as you go away 300 kilometers from its initial point of introduction. This is a typical catch from a 1 square meter kick sample of rusty crayfish. This is a photograph of the bottom of a bucket. I don't know what to say here. Just take a look at this bucket. This gives you just a sheer indication of the biomass and the number of crayfish that we're seeing. It's quite remarkably high density compared to other parts of its invaded range. Definitely compared to some of the places which I studied rusty crayfish in the upper Midwest. So it's a very, very high density. And what we were interested in looking at, saying, well, what are the kind of the future spread of rusty crayfish in the John Day River? And can we evaluate kind of management opportunities to try to control them in the future? So what does that look like through kind of a modeling context? So I just want to spend just a little bit of time talking about this, and then focusing on what control and management strategies are possible, not only for rusty crayfish, but for other crayfish in the region. So I'm not going to spend much time on these details, but in essence, we use an individual-based model. So what does that mean? It means that we have a model in which we track hypothetical individual crayfish through time and through space. And we ask the question, basically through monthly time steps, how do those individual crayfish move, reproduce, and then ultimately die over multiple generations. And they do that in response to a whole variety of environmental factors. So we know that crayfish movement is a function of flow velocity. We know it's affected by, say, temperature. So I'm showing growing degree days in the John Day River there on the right. It has a function of slope, channel width. So there's a whole variety of factors that go into this. And we just basically, through the rich literature that we know about rusty crayfish and the types of factors that influence their movement and reproduction across the landscape, and we basically just shove that right into this individual-based model to take a look at the spread of crayfish through the region. So that's what we did. We did that, and we basically tried to forecast using the data from the 2005 and 2010 surveys to forecast to 2016. And then we went out, and I showed some of that data earlier, to actually test it. We actually said, how well did the model do? We recalibrated it, and then we forecasted it to 2025, and which is basically now. And you'll see in a second why we kind of stopped at that year. So this is a very quick slide. All I want to show to you is if you progress from the top down to the bottom, that is the life cycle of a crayfish. in the different components of the model. So crayfish, rusty crayfish, live in this system to around 4 or 5 years of age. They have different reproductive statuses, so they mature basically at age 2, the majority of them. They reproduce at different amounts, they have different number of eggs, and that's a function of density. Then they disperse some fraction, so we know movement studies of rusty crayfish and how far they move, and then they die. And then we basically iterate that over and over and over again, and we track literally, as I will show you, tens of thousands or millions of crayfish as they crawl their way through the John Day River. So this is just a little disclaimer to go ahead and hang on to your desks there. The rusties are not only coming, that they're already here. Apologies for this slide. Okay, so this is going to be an illustration of the model predictions of rusty crayfish. On the top, you'll see every month is being played out, and then the increasing orange to red shows the spread through time from the initial introduction. You can see the crayfish model is showing that it's spreading downstream at an increasing rate, and then up the North Fork and the South Fork. And then you can see it continues to increase to 2016. And then we projected the model out with the pulses being big reproduction events to 2021 to 2022. And you can see as this model plays out, and we end it in May 2025. So this model is a very deterministic and very powerful model to show the where and the when of crayfish spread, not only within the main stem, but within the tributaries of the John Day, populated by empirical data. And then we can ask how well the model did based on our survey in 2016. And so this just shows different snapshots of the model. And the upper left there just shows you kind of the projections of rusty crayfish in the river system and the observed presence and absences across the basin. And then you just basically tab through time, 2010, 2016, and then on the right-hand side just shows the stats for the model accuracy. The take-home is the model does fairly well, and it does a really good job of predicting the leading edge of the invasion, as well as doing a pretty good job of predicting the density of crayfish, rusty crayfish across the system. This is a sobering photo. It is also a sobering photo because if you then crank up this model and you continue to advance it to 2025, that is when our model predicts rusty crayfish will meet the main stem of the Columbia River. So this figure shows the invaded river length shown on the left y-axis, and the crayfish population size shown on the right-hand side in red through time as projected by the model. So I'd just like to show that since their initial introduction, likely in the late 90s, you can see that present day rusty crayfish occupies around 750 river kilometers of the John Day River. And by the time that projection goes to 2025, it will occupy around 1,100 kilometers, at which point it's projected to enter the main stem of the Columbia. On the right-hand side is the population size. And again, this is an estimate, but it shows that we're not talking about a small number of crayfish, but we're talking about crayfish in the order of millions that are in the river basin. Projected, as well as what our density surveys show for the river, as well as projected into the future. So just taking a step back, there's kind of this is kind of a sobering look, if you will, at the John Day River example with rusty crayfish. But there's a whole variety of really exciting avenues that have been taken more recently to try to prevent new invasions of all crayfish in the Pacific Northwest. So some examples of this, for example, has been actually, regulating, if you will, crayfish catches within Washington State as well as Oregon. So although in Washington State, you don't require a license to harvest crayfish, there's now preventions on actually removing live non-native crayfish away from the riparian zone or the point of capture. So that's super important as we think about minimizing new introductions or secondary spread. Strong education campaigns, at least to identify those that are infested. current populations within different water bodies. Early detection is obviously a very key role when we think about invasive crayfish. So I'm happy to see, there's a number of obviously opportunities both in Washington and Oregon to report non-native species, either on apps or online or on phone hotlines with respect to where these initial introductions occur. I hope that my results from the John Day River shows that it's really important to actually know where those initial points of introduction are, particularly if we look to minimize spread. From kind of an educational point of view, there's also kind of been strong kind of regulatory changes led by WDFW in terms of the use of live non-native crayfish in the classroom. Fortunately, we can't have the time to talk about that on this webinar, but it's a very fruitful and important area in terms of trying to think about ways of tackling this large issue. And then there's controlling or eradicating existing populations. This kind of figure is just a summary, if you will, of the different methods shown in the left-hand column, from mechanical to that's kind of mechanical trapping, to physical effects like barriers, biological or biocides, and then their kind of success, if you will, from low to high or efficiency for different aspects of the removal process. So I highlight this to show that there's a lot of really exciting options to try to control or eradicate. But in general, I'd like to focus you on the very first row, which is trapping. That remains very effective in terms of reducing population size and its application, if you will, in a variety of contexts. And it's also pretty efficient with respect to time and cost. So this mechanical removal, if you will, has been used in a variety of different situations. I just wanted to kind of highlight this in terms of some really early work in the 80s, but now kind of current day removal efforts. These efforts have largely been done in isolated water bodies. So whether they're ponds or lakes, and obviously success there is somewhat larger because the chances of reintroduction or reinvasion naturally is a lot smaller in, say, drainage or seepage lakes than there are in open rivers. There's also been some really exciting, I'd say, opportunities to think about citizen science and volunteer-based removal efforts. This happens to be some work that I've been leading in a lake just outside of the Seattle area, in which lake landowners are extremely interested, and lake associations are extremely interested in playing some role in controlling the invasion of these species. So I've been working with them, working on that lake Pine Lake for over 10 years, but then removal efforts over the last 4 years. So for example, engaging in households across the perimeter of lakes. This is just an example of the array of around 100 volunteers that we had collecting crayfish off of docks using baited traps. Just to show that, and over time have really significantly reduced the population, in this case of red swam crayfish. So there's really good opportunities to engage the public, not only in early detection, but also in local scale control, in this case not eradication, but control. What's interesting is that, this intensive trapping effort is really important, particularly as new invasions occur. Work by Rick Boatner and others have kind of been really focusing in on some of these new localized invasions of rusty crayfish out just south of the John Day River. I'm shown here in the Malheur National Forest and adjacent lands, where there's been a lot of effort, particularly in Summit Prairie Pond, to physically remove crayfish out of these small water bodies. So this is encouraging, if you will, but also raises the issue of, how many more potential invasion sites are there out there. So just real quick, I just want to show you how we've used this modeling framework to try to talk about how efficient can we be, or what is the return on investment, if you will, of potentially controlling rusty crayfish in the John Day River, and what kind of effort is required to do that. The point I'm going to make here really quick is that early detection is important. So in this figure, on the x-axis is kind of a start of a yearly removal effort. So imagine that we started to physically remove or trap out rusty crayfish from the John Day River. And then on the y-axis is the mortality rate from that trapping. So i.e. anywhere from 0% of the population removing all the way up to 50% of the entire population. So that'd be a high amount of trapping effort. And then the color gradation basically just shows what would be the estimated invaded river length under those different management scenarios. So if you go all the way down to the lower bottom right corner, that would be basically if we do nothing. So we have no removal, and what happens in 2025, and that equals the around 1,100 kilometer invasion all the way down to the Columbia River. Those are the projections that I showed you previously. As you progress to the upper left, this shows your return on investment in terms of different amounts of trapping effort. So you can see that it's always really important, if you can, in early detection to trap early, because for any yearly mortality rate, you're always going to be reducing more river length if you act early. And many of us are aware of that. So we can look at this to say what would have been the benefit of removing initially very quick. And I'll go through one scenario. Imagine we removed and did trapping effort in 2001, right after we discovered the population, or whether we did it in 2009, or if we started right now. In this case, this projection was done for 2017. So what does this look like for the Columbia River, or for the John Day River? So these are 4 maps to basically go through each of those 4 scenarios of trapping effort. So in the upper right, we show assuming that we trapped 50% of the population across the entire range starting in 2001, and we can compare that to the upper left, which shows if we do nothing. So you can see if we acted early and pretty strong, there'd be a very large influence on not only the geographic extent of the invasion, i.e. we would actually prevent what our model predicts to be in the invasion of the Columbia River by 2025, but also the density of them. And then as you go from the lower left, 2009 and 2017, you can see the return on that investment is not as great because basically the cat's already out of the bag. There's been a huge amount of invasion. But even given that, even if we act now and we start to control within the John Day, our model projections show that we can actually prevent the invasion of the Columbia River by 2025 through these control efforts. Now, I don't have the time to kind of talk a little bit about what the level of effort would be, i.e. the trapping effort that would require to achieve these reductions, but I should say that it's not out of the realm of possibility in terms of management effort. So in conclusion, I just want to kind of highlight a couple big points about invasive crayfish issues in the Pacific Northwest. I'd argue this represents a very significant but overlooked threat to the ecosystems, of all ecosystems, but even particularly in the Columbia River. As our focus on the Columbia River continues to look at other predators of Pacific salmon, whether or not that's pinnipeds or whether or not that's pike minnow or smallmouth bass, I'd argue that there's very large food web level effects of invasive crayfish, both indirect and direct, and that's going to play out as they continue to move upstream into critical rearing and spawning habitat for salmon. New populations continue to be discovered constantly, and the rate of secondary spread, as I showed in the John Day River, is quite massive. But early responses are critical, and even without early responses, management actions today can still substantially decrease the spread and densities of crayfish in a whole variety of systems. And I hope I've illustrated that that's possible for the John Day, but it's also very possible for many of the lakes that are invaded by other crayfish species in the region. And finally, I just think there's really great opportunities for partnerships between kind of scientists and natural resource managers to tackle this issue. There's a lot of interest out there to kind of trap crayfish out of these individual water bodies to try to control for them. But if we couple that with really good hypothesis-driven science, I would argue that those efforts that are very localized can actually inform decisions made in different parts on the landscape. And currently, we really, we're missing that connection, and that'd be something that I'd like to see more of. So for that, I'll just wrap up. I'll throw the mic over to Brianna and others, and happy to take any questions now or email me at any time. Thanks for everyone's attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julian. That was great. And like he said, at this point, we can take questions. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box, and I'll relay them on to Julian, or any questions you might have for Rick about the Oregon Invasive Species Council. Ah, there they are. Sorry, guys. There were some questions that they just weren't popping up. All right. At 20 plus rusty crayfish per square meter, are you finding any other species or have they displayed all natives?
Yeah, great. That's awesome question. Yes. So the short answer is no. Our extensive survey of the John Day River a couple of years ago in the summer of 2016, across those hundreds of kilometers, and where rusty crayfish occurred, we never ever caught a signal crayfish. And then as soon as we got outside of the leading edge of the invasion, then we started picking up signal crayfish again. So it's pretty strong, clear indication. And we've done some competitive trials, I should mention, between rusty crayfish and other crayfish in mesocosms and signal crayfish, and they tend to outcompete them within their invaded range. So all indications are that signal crayfish have been basically displaced or outcompeted throughout the invaded range.
All right, thank you. So this one, what are the fate of trapped crayfish? Human consumption, incineration, compost, etc. Are you concerned by secondary invasion from captured crayfish?
Great question. Yes, I'm concerned in general. So that's the challenge, is that crayfish are getting, it's a very small proportion of the population, but they are getting recreationally trapped out of these water bodies. And I ran into people who are quite benefiting from the rusty crayfish invasion in terms of trapping. Anytime there's any type of value put on to an invasive crayfish, it runs the risk of them being intentionally transplanted to new water bodies. So that is one of the reasons, for example, rusty crayfish were introduced into numerous lakes in northern Wisconsin, is that people were kind of provided or trying to provide these new opportunities for themselves to harvest them. So crayfish, if removed, can be used for a variety of reasons. They can be directly consumed. They can be composed. There's a whole variety of things that they can be used. A good crawfish étouffée doesn't hurt anyone. But in general, the cuisine around crayfish obviously is quite different here in the Northwest than it is in the southern parts of the United States.
All right, and so that gets to a couple other questions out here. Are people able to consume the trapped crayfish? So there you go. Let's see. Have you found any change on native fish population in the John Day River, and is it possible to relate that with crayfish dispersion?
Yeah, good question. I think what's interesting is that rusty crayfish has been studied extensively in terms of their ecological impacts in their invaded range in the eastern part of the United States, but we actually know fairly little about them here in their invaded range. Something that I would like to remedy if provided the opportunity to kind of start new projects in the region. I think, but that knowledge from other areas can really point to the effects that they have. So, I mean, there's been strong evidence for effects on, in particular, benthic invertebrates, and also through kind of direct fish egg predation. And there's been evidence from other crayfish on Atlantic salmon, for example, that they can have very large impacts. Their impacts in these systems are still a little bit unclear. And I think it's something that I would like to explore more, kind of how do those impacts manifest themselves across different gradients or densities of rusty crayfish. And then how is that also likely to interact with other species in the landscape, for example, smallmouth bass, which preferentially consume crayfish, but then is also a predator of concern in these systems. So there's complex kind of food web interactions going on here, but much work to be done.
All right, and following up on that, people are asking, are there any specific studies or specific evidence for the crayfish effect on native salmonids, especially in the lake system?
Yeah, again, a really great question from in the region and here in Pacific salmon. The answer is not that I'm aware of. There's been some work, and I'm actually happy to forward to anyone in terms, again, on Atlantic salmon and elsewhere in its range. But in this region, there hasn't been much work on that. And again, I think there kind of continues to be, there's the smoking gun and the direct consumption, if you will, of juveniles or eggs. And then there's the plethora of kind of indirect effects, particularly as they affect the kind of the base of the food web and the food that is available to Pacific salmon.
All right. So now there are a couple questions asking about what effects, if any, are the crayfish having on water quality, especially like turbidity, nitrogen, phosphorus. Are they changing any of these water quality levels or characteristics?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, I can tell you that so crayfish, particularly high abundances, can affect water quality. Largely, that's because they're consuming, again, much of that prey base, but but they have a high number of rates of nutrient recycling, so particularly nitrogen. So there's been studies that shows kind of the effects of basically phosphorus and nitrogen regeneration through the feces of crayfish, particularly at really high densities. So that's an important issue. They also consume grazing snails, which then can basically have a top-down positive effect on the amount of periphyton on the stream bed. So there's yes. So the short answer is yes. There are evidence of crayfish affecting those components of the food web.
All right. And following up on water quality, now people are wondering, what are some of the effects you might be seeing on native vegetation?
Yeah, so that's a good one. So between the two species, red swamp crayfish is more preferentially kind of consumes macrophytes in underwater vegetation. So compared to rusty crayfish. Not to say rusty crayfish doesn't. So, but red swamp crayfish are kind of known to be a large consumers of macrophytes. So that affects obviously, critical fish habitat, rearing habitat for freshwater fish, particularly kind of in lakes, but also in rivers as well. So yeah, they're quite effective at consumption of and breaking down of macrophytes, particularly red swamp crayfish. And that's an issue in lakes, but also in rivers like the Willamette River, where red swamp crayfish is quite abundant.
All right. To your knowledge, is eDNA being used to detect invasive crayfish populations in the Northwest?
So eDNA for rusty crayfish and other crayfish have been created and have been looked at in large part by actually my collaborator Eric Larson now, who's a professor in the University of Illinois. So the libraries exist for in terms of being able to kind of barcode water samples for these species. My group has not used them directly. We've used eDNA in terms of detection of smallmouth bass throughout the Columbia River Basin, and leading edge invasions. That's another story, not crayfish related, but no, that's an area that Eric and I actually have talked about, and we're keen to kind of apply to different river basins in the Columbia, particularly as it relates to more cryptic initial introductions of rusty crayfish.
And I will say that as far as eDNA, that is one of our growing sampling tactics in the state, especially the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're now using that to test for New Zealand mud snails, northern pike, and quagga and zebra mussels. So it is definitely a technique that is gaining some traction. Let's see. There are a lot of good questions in here. So if I don't get to your question, I'm sorry, and we can try to email them on to Julian later, but we'll do a couple more here. So, following trapping, have you observed some density compensation by a decrease in age or size at maturity or a change in dispersal?
Great question. So I can answer that from work that we've done in Pine Lake, this lake outside of Seattle, in which we've been trapping red swamp crayfish, and we moved around 10,000 or so from that lake, because I've been looking at that population over a decade now. we've seen no indication of compensatory kind of responses with respect to total fecundity or timing of reproduction of red swamp crayfish in response to those removal efforts. I think large part because probably those efforts are occurring much more rapidly. If anything, we're seeing more of a climate-driven signal with red swamp crayfish, so much so that they will produce multiple times throughout the year, and that's how they differ from our native signal crayfish. And the challenges we have are with kind of climate-related warmer winters. Often provides the opportunity for red swamp crayfish to kind of squeeze in an extra reproductive bout. So what we're finding is in lakes around this greater Seattle area is that with milder winters often result in kind of large increases in red swamp crayfish. But it is an open question whether or not you would see strong kind of compensatory effects. And trapping often selects for removal of certain types of individuals, large males, predominantly. So there are kind of challenges and issues around how we would trap out at a large scale. But yes, kind of we haven't seen much evidence for that yet.
Okay. And sort of building on that, you mentioned mild winters being a great way for them to squeeze in another reproductive cycle. People were wondering, is there something special about the John Day that's leading to these particularly high densities? Or like what are some of the best predictors of crayfish abundance?
It's a great question. I think John Day is not special environmentally with respect to promoting the invasion of rusty crayfish, unfortunately. I think the John Day just happened to be seeded with a number of individuals in the late 90s, which provided this opportunity of a crayfish to go in to a system with very low biotic resistance with respect to other crayfish species. So as I mentioned earlier, signal crayfish historically are in these river drainages, although they have not nearly reached the levels of abundance. So our sampling of signal crayfish in other parts of the John Day or other rivers in the Columbia River Basin shows that they're at much lower abundances. So this is really, I think, an example of an open niche for invasive crayfish and an open system with respect to kind of the movement throughout. So it's, the models that we have generated here, and I'm actually quite interested then of basically saying, the scenarios of using this model, but in other river basins, to ask the question, what if? And more importantly, depending on where the location is, that can really drive the subsequent spread. But I just hope that I show for this crayfish, for example, that it's spread on average of 15 kilometers per year since its initial introduction, plus or minus. And so that's a very fast invasion into a very unoccupied kind of habitat for it. So environmentally, it's quite suitable for rusty crayfish.
Sorry, I'm just trying to combine a couple of these questions if possible.
No worries. I appreciate everyone's question.
There's a lot of great ones. Let's see. Is there any evidence for some natural population control starting to emerge at the areas of first introduction that have now had rusties for 15 to 20 years?
Another great question. Not my sense on it. I think this is I'm really intrigued by this system and want to study more is this fact that the downstream invasion of rusty crayfish is occurring as the upstream invasion of smallmouth bass is occurring. And this is where this project is kind of dovetailing with a bunch of bass work that we've been doing in the region. And smallmouth bass, preferentially about 85% of their diet can be crayfish. So as they move downstream, there's going to be these kind of population level effects, allele effects, if you will, so slow population growth at the edge. And I'm guessing that there's going to be some level of biotic resistance through predation by increasingly more and more bass mouths feeding upon rusty crayfish as they move downstream. I can imagine, and northern pike minnow also consume crayfish, but not like bass. So yes, there's some level, but my indication of being in that river system is that the sheer number of them, if anything, density dependent effects within of crayfish are going to kick in before kind of biological predation effects kick in.
All right. So I'm going to answer one of these questions, which will then lead into another question for you. So someone was asking, is there data or are there projects on other invasive species in the Pacific Northwest? And we do have a repository of invasive species data available through a website called EDDMAPS, EDDMAPS. And EDDMAPS is open source data on invasive species, and it's a really nifty place to store data because you as individuals can actually contribute to that data source. The Invasive Species Council has the Washington Invasives app, which allows people to report invasive species. We then verify those reports and send them to whatever agency is in charge of dealing with them. And then all of the verified data is sent to EDDMAPS. So if you need to know about an invasive species around the state, and actually it's a countrywide, but particular in Washington, if you want to know about Washington invasives, you can get the data from there, download it, use it to make maps. But as far as the question for you, and I'm not sure about this one, are these species mapped via EDDMAPS, or can the data be provided to EDDMAPS?
I don't know if they're in EDDMAPS. I've personally, yeah, all of this data is available. I've provided it to a number of folks and happy to provide it to more, including the Washington Invasive Species Council. I've entered a number of these things in iNaturalist as well, which obviously provides another platform for the public to report occurrences. So yeah, I mean, it's exceedingly important. So, and this, yeah, and I can point to people. We've posted all the results of this modeling, the data, and everything on a Figshare account, which is publicly available. So yeah, we're game, and if anyone is interested to contacting me as well, I can provide it in any shape or form that folks are interested in.
All right, excellent. So sounds like
I'll jump in here.
Oh, yep.
The Oregon Invasive Council, we have the IMAP system set up for reporting invasive species.
All right.
And that's on our website.
So if you're in Oregon, use IMAP. If you're in Washington, we have the Washington Invasives app. And we also, you can report online or give us a call. And then to Julian's point, the data is available on multiple sources. So it sounds like they could contact you if they need to find it, but it is out there. All right. We have time maybe for one or two more quick questions. There we go. Would trapping catch enough of the population to prevent resurgence from juveniles? And are there possible allay densities that you could push them below to extinction levels?
Yeah, awesome questions. I wish, yeah, so the latter question, to kind of push them below kind of elite thresholds in terms of then having negative population growth, i.e. inability of crayfish to find mates, for example, because of extremely low numbers. Just given the fecundity of crayfish, I would suggest, I would hazard to say that's very unlikely to happen, unfortunately. And shoot, the first part of the question was what was it? The ability to reduce them, the trapping effort. Was that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm happy to forward kind of the paper that we had on this. We actually looked at the number of trap hours. So like how many traps set out overnight would be required to obtain those levels of removal. And that accounted for a whole variety of things in terms of how long you set the trap, the density of crayfish, because we really wanted to get at that currency of, is this really possible? And the short of it is that, you know, we can't remove probably 70 or 80% of the population. It's just not possible. But a number of us have really good interest in basically testing, you know, is it possible, particularly at the leading edge of invasions, to suppress the population so that we can try to contain the current population, and also do trapping in a variety of ways that target not just adults, sorry to get back at the question, but also target juveniles. So that is, so yeah, that's the hope. And there's been a variety of approaches to think about different types of trapping to target juveniles versus adults. But in general, what you want to do is trap fecund buried females, so females that have eggs during that time of the year. Although they're difficult to trap because they don't move around a lot, that's usually the sweet spot.
Great. All right, and one more. Have you conducted stable isotope analysis on the invasive crayfish population?
Yes. So we did stable isotope analysis of rusty crayfish across their entire range. I'm happy to share that paper. It's in press right now. Basically, we were trying to look at the question of, does the trophic position of crayfish change from the leading edge to the core of its invasion? So is it higher or lower depending on where it is in the river basin? And it does vary. So first, the stable isotope shows that they're very polytrophic, but it also shows that they tend to eat, they're more generalist at the leading edges of their invasion as opposed to specializing. So yes, that's we have looked at that and really actually excited to kind of look more at that in terms of, can we start to understand or use those isotopes to understand just exactly how much of what they're eating across their range. So I'm happy to talk about any of these things, and even just to give me a call, I'm happy to talk or do anything like that. I'm happy if anyone is interested in crayfish, and I know there's some people on the line laughing about that right now.
All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again, Julian and Rick, for being with us.